Imagine being sentenced to death because you toasted a friend with your left hand. In the Middle Ages, chivalry wasn't a polite suggestion. It was a bizarre legal minefield where a single clumsy gesture could cost you your head. We are exposing 50 of the most baffling, hilarious, and nonsensical laws that governed the world's famous warriors. You will soon realize the heroic age of knights was actually a bureaucratic nightmare of epic and frequently ridiculous proportions. 1. In the complex world of medieval etiquette, the left hand was basically considered the devil's workshop. Using your left hand to toast a comrade or offer a gift wasn't just a social faux pas. It was a legitimate legal insult that could trigger a duel to the death. The law stated that noble actions must be performed with the dexter or right hand to ensure purity of intent. Imagine losing your life because you're a lefty. It makes modern left-handed scissors struggles seem like a total luxury. 2. Mourning laws were surprisingly specific and strictly enforced. If a knight's lord passed away, the knight was often legally required to wear black-tinted armor or cover his shield with dark cloth for a designated period of legal grief. Failing to display this visual mourning was seen as a breach of his service contract and could result in the loss of his pension. It's the original corporate dress code, but for funerals and with a lot more heavy metal involved than your average office attire. 3. You might think knights were all about courtly love and sensitive poetry, but the laws regarding emotional outbursts were brutal. A knight was legally forbidden from crying in public, especially after losing a tournament or getting injured in a skirmish. To shed a tear was to forfeit your honor, and in some courts, your right to bear arms for a full calendar year. This led to a generation of men who walked around with massive internal trauma and very dry eyes. If you were legally barred from showing any emotion other than righteous fury, how long would you last before you absolutely lost your mind? 4. Specific codes of chivalry dictated exactly how a knight should eat poultry. Using more than 3 fingers to pick up a piece of meat was considered a sign of a peasant upbringing and could lead to a formal reprimand from the king's own herald. Apparently, the fate of the kingdom and your standing in the military hierarchy rested entirely on your pinky placement during a feast. If one finger went rogue, your social reputation died right there on the plate alongside the pheasant. 5. Drawing your sword during a feast, even just to show off the craftsmanship or settle a minor debate about blade length, was a massive legal violation. In the 14th century, this wasn't just rude. It was considered an act of treason against the host's peace. A knight who drew steel at the dinner table could be stripped of his title on the spot. Does our modern society need more rules like this to stop people from being aggressive in public? Or is the concept of mutual combat just a lost art we should bring back? 6. Sumptuary laws were the medieval fashion police. And for a knight, wearing the wrong shade of purple or gold thread could lead to a heavy fine or imprisonment. These weren't just style suggestions. They were laws designed to ensure you didn't look too rich for your actual rank. Imagine getting arrested because your shirt was too vibrant for your current pay grade. It's the ultimate "who do you think you are" moment enforced by the state, where your wardrobe choices were a literal legal liability. 7. If a knight was captured in battle, there was a very specific, legally binding set of rules for his behavior. He was expected to live as a guest of his captor, often sharing meals and even hunting together, all while waiting for his family to sell the farm to pay his ransom. If he tried to escape, he wasn't just a jailbreaker, he was a lawbreaker who lost his chivalric status forever. It was a gentleman's agreement with the highest possible stakes, essentially turning war into a very expensive kidnapping scheme where you had to be polite to your kidnapper. 8. Having rusty armor was more than a fashion crime. It was often a punishable offense. A knight with poorly maintained gear was seen as a man who didn't respect his office, his king, or the safety of the men under his command. In many orders, showing up to a muster with a rusty breastplate resulted in a fine that could cost a month's wages. It's the original dress for the job you want, but with much more WD-40 required and the threat of a public shaming that would follow you to the grave. 9. Medieval chivalry codes had zero tolerance for coarse language, especially around nobility or the clergy. A knight caught using a 12th century four-letter word faced more than just a lecture. He was legally required to stand barefoot outside a cathedral for a full day as public penance. It was the ultimate timeout for warriors. If we enforce this on social media today, would the world finally become civil? Or would we all just be standing in the mud with cold toes? 10. In some French codes of chivalry, a knight who was carrying a hawk was legally exempt from certain social obligations, like bowing to a superior or yielding the path. The bird's comfort was prioritized over human hierarchy because a startled hawk was considered a ruined hunting tool, which was a serious economic loss. It's one of the few times in history where having a bird on your arm gave you the legal right to be a total snob to your boss and walk through any door first without saying sorry. 11. If a knight was convicted of treason or cowardice, the law dictated a brutal ritual known as the abatement of arms. His shield wasn't just taken away, it was hung upside down in a public square or the Great Hall for everyone to see. This was a legal death sentence for your reputation, ensuring that even if you kept your head, you could never show your face in polite society again. It's the medieval equivalent of being permanently banned from every social platform at once, with no hope of an appeal. 12. Dining etiquette in the Middle Ages was a legitimate legal minefield, especially the one-plate rule. In many noble courts, it was a legal requirement for two guests, usually a knight and a lady, to share a single plate and a single cup throughout the entire meal. This wasn't just about saving on dishes. It was a forced exercise in courtly sharing. If you were a fast eater or had a heavy hand with the wine, you could actually be sued for dishonorable greed by your dining partner. 13. Believe it or not, your facial hair was subject to strict chivalric regulations. In certain military orders, such as the Knights Templar, growing a beard was actually a legal requirement, but it had to be kept at a specific, modest length. Trimming it too short was seen as an attempt to look vain or worldly, which could lead to a week of fasting on bread and water. It's funny how a society that valued warriors so much was so terrified of a well-groomed goatee. 14. The law was incredibly specific about how a knight could defend himself against someone of a lower social class. If a peasant attacked you, using your sword was often legally forbidden because the sword was a noble weapon. Instead, you were expected to use a mace, a staff, or just your armored fists. To use a blade on a commoner was to debase the steel and your own honor. Does this sound like a fair way to limit excessive force, or just another way to keep the elite feeling superior, even in a street fight? 15. Some knights took dedication to the cause to a legal extreme by swearing vows that prevented them from removing their armor for months at a time. This wasn't just a personal choice. Once the vow was witnessed by a priest or a lord, it became a legal obligation. They had to eat, sleep, and travel in 40 pounds of steel until a specific goal was met, like reaching a certain shrine. The smell must have been a biological weapon in its own right, proving that chivalry often came at the cost of basic hygiene. 16. Splashing a lady with mud while riding through a town wasn't just a clumsy accident. It was a legal offense under the codes of many chivalric orders. If a knight's horse kicked up debris that ruined a woman's dress, he was legally required to compensate her with a new garment or perform a specific act of service to restore his honor. It was the original no-fault insurance, designed to ensure that noblemen didn't treat the public roads like their own personal racetrack. 17. In many tournament circuits, there was a ridiculous law regarding clumsy equipment failure. If your spear shattered before making contact with your opponent, it wasn't just embarrassing, it was a legal liability. The law of the broken spear dictated that you had to pay for your opponent's equipment as if you'd actually lost the match. It basically criminalized bad luck and technical glitches. If you were forced to pay a clumsy tax every time you accidentally tripped or dropped your phone today, would it make you more graceful, or would you just end up completely broke? 18. In the world of tournaments, your coat of arms was your legal ID. If a knight entered a jousting competition using a shield or colors that didn't belong to his family, he wasn't just cheating. He was committing a form of legal identity theft. The penalty was often the confiscation of his horse and armor, which was basically his entire net worth. It kept the blue bloods in and the imposters' knights out, ensuring the tournament remained an exclusive club for the ultra-wealthy. 19. There was a bizarre law regarding unattended ladies on the road. If a knight encountered a woman traveling without a male guardian, he was legally bound to offer her protection for the duration of her journey. However, if he failed to treat her with the utmost respect during that time, his punishment was doubled because he had violated a sacred trust. It was a mandatory escort service where the stakes were literally your life and your reputation. 20. In certain parts of Europe, knights were legally exempt from paying bridge tolls or ferry fees, but there was a catch. Instead of paying with coins, they were sometimes required to pay by telling a story, reciting a poem, or performing a feat of strength for the tollkeeper. It was the only time in history where exposure was actually a legally recognized currency for professionals. If you had to perform a 3-minute stand-up routine every time you hit a toll booth on the highway, would you pay the $5 instead, or would you embrace the spotlight? 21. In the high-stakes world of royal courts, sitting in the wrong chair wasn't just a social blunder, it was a legal affront to the crown. If a knight sat in a seat reserved for a higher-ranking noble, he was legally required to apologize publicly and often pay a hefty fine to the person he displaced. It is essentially the 14th century version of accidentally sitting in the VIP section at a stadium and being sued for the full price of a season ticket just because you wanted a better view. 22. The no-retreat statute was a brutal piece of military law. In certain ultra-strict chivalric orders, a knight who lost his shield in the heat of battle was legally obligated to find it or die in the process. Returning home without your shield meant you were officially labeled a runaway, and the crown had the legal right to seize your family's ancestral lands. It makes the modern lost and found bin at the gym look like a very low-stakes game. 23. Let's talk about the bizarre legal tradition of the vow of the bird. During grand feasts, knights would sometimes swear incredibly binding legal oaths over a roasted pheasant or a heron. Once these words were spoken in front of witnesses, they became a legally enforceable contract. A knight might swear not to eat meat, cut his hair, or sleep in a proper bed until he captured a specific enemy castle. If he failed to fulfill the vow or tried to back out, he was stripped of his title and declared a breaker of faith. It sounds poetic and noble until you realize a grown man is legally obligated to sleep on a cold stone floor for 3 years because he got a little too excited after 4 glasses of wine and a cooked bird. 24. There was a surprisingly strict law regarding where a knight could park his ride. If you tethered your stallion too close to a lady's chamber or in a way that blocked the main hall's entrance, you weren't just being a jerk. You were violating the code of hospitality. In some regions, a knight who improperly parked his horse could have the animal seized by the local lord as a legal forfeit. It was basically the 13th century equivalent of getting your Ferrari towed for blocking a fire hydrant, except the tow truck driver is wearing chainmail. 25. The parole of honor was a fascinating legal loophole where a captured knight could actually go home to gather his ransom money as long as he gave his word that he would return to his captors. If he broke that promise, he was legally declared dead to society. No one could talk to him, trade with him, or offer him shelter. It was a legal system built entirely on the idea that a man's word was a physical, unbreakable bond. Do you think our modern legal system would actually be better if we relied on honor instead of massive jail complexes and digital ankle monitors? 26. In some chivalric traditions, wearing certain colors was a legal admission of your current status or character. Yellow was often legally reserved for those who had failed a specific quest, while green was for those officially seeking love. Showing up to a high-level diplomatic meeting in the wrong color could be interpreted as a legal declaration of intent or even a subtle insult to the host. It's like accidentally wearing a "please punch me" sign to a board meeting because you didn't check the morning's color coding manual. 27. The bed law in military camps dictated that a knight must never sleep in a more comfortable arrangement than his commanding officer. If the general was sleeping in a tent on the bare ground, the knight was legally forbidden from using a raised cot or extra furs. Violating this was seen as a legal challenge to the military hierarchy and a sign of unworthy luxury. It ensured that the elite suffered together, which is a nice sentiment until you're the one with a permanent backache because your boss happens to prefer sleeping on the dirt. 28. Trial by combat had some truly bizarre equalizer laws to keep the proceedings legal. If a knight was challenged by someone physically weaker, like an elderly man or even a woman, the law often required the knight to be buried waist-deep in a hole or have one arm tied behind his back during the fight. This wasn't just about being gentlemanly. It was a strict legal requirement to ensure the judgment of God wasn't biased by raw physical strength. It turned a serious legal proceeding into a weirdly handicapped sporting event where the odds were literally buried in the sand. 29. There were specific laws stating that a knight must show more respect to a noble's hunting dog than to a common servant. If you accidentally kicked a prize hound, you could be fined more heavily than if you had injured a person of lower social status. It's a stark reminder that in the medieval world, your legal value was often tied more to your pedigree or your owners than your basic humanity. If your dog currently has more legal rights and protections than your neighbors, is that a society worth defending or just a very expensive kennel? 30. Knights were often legally forbidden from playing dice or gambling while wearing their spurs. The logic was that gentlemen shouldn't mix the symbols of their high military rank with base and common vices. If a knight was caught gambling in full gear, his spurs could be hacked off with a cleaver by the camp cook, a public, humiliating, and very permanent legal demotion. It was the ultimate way to ensure that work and play stayed completely separate, with the threat of a kitchen utensil hanging over your head. 31. In the intricate world of heraldry, entering a peaceful town with an uncovered shield was legally considered a threat of immediate siege. You were required by law to wrap your shield's coat of arms in leather or cloth to show you weren't looking for a fight. It's essentially the 14th century version of being legally required to put a safety lock on your weapon the second you walk into a grocery store, except your weapon is just a piece of wood with a painted lion on it. 32. In the Middle Ages, even a simple knock was a legal minefield. Knights were strictly forbidden from using their bare knuckles on a castle gate. That was considered a peasant's gesture and a sign of low breeding. Instead, the law required them to use the pommel of their sword or the butt of their lance to announce their arrival. Knocking with your fist wasn't just rude. It was a legal failure of martial dignity that could get you ignored or even slapped with a fine for lack of decorum. 33. In certain regions, the bridge waiting law was a literal traffic nightmare. A knight was legally barred from crossing a narrow bridge if a lady was visible on the other side, no matter how far away she was. He had to wait until she completed her crossing before he could even set foot on the planks. If he got impatient and pushed past, he could be sued for damage to noble dignity. This led to entire military patrols being delayed for hours, just because a noblewoman was taking a leisurely stroll with her lapdog. Imagine your GPS telling you that your 10-minute commute is now 2 hours because someone in a fancy dress is currently using the road. 34. There was a strict legal protocol for mounting a horse in public. If a knight missed his stirrup or stumbled while getting into the saddle, he was legally considered unfit for service for the remainder of the day and had to pay a fine to the local heralds. It sounds petty, but it ensured that every public appearance was a perfect display of athletic prowess. Is it fair to expect world-class performance from our leaders 24/7? Or should we allow them the dignity of having a clumsy Monday morning just like the rest of us? 35. To prevent high-stakes diplomatic dinners from devolving into chaotic barroom brawls, many chivalric codes legally mandated that all wine be diluted with at least 2 parts water. Drinking your vintage neat wasn't seen as being a connoisseur. It was a punishable offense against the virtue of temperance. Violating this could land a legendary warrior in the public stocks for the night. It turns out the world's fiercest killers were legally forced to sip on what were basically medieval juice boxes. 36. The weapon hierarchy law was a brutal display of class warfare. If a knight lost his sword during a duel, he was often legally prohibited from picking up a dishonorable tool like a pitchfork or a meat cleaver to defend himself. He was expected to fight with his armored fists, or simply surrender like a gentleman. Surviving a battle by using a peasant's tool was a legal stain on your family's lineage that could last for 3 generations. Talk about a death before dishonor policy. 37. Medieval feasts were crowded, messy affairs, but there were strict legal guidelines for even the grossest bodily functions. A knight was legally forbidden from spitting across the table or onto the floor where someone might step. He was required to spit directly under his own chair or into a designated scrap of cloth. Violating this spitting protocol resulted in immediate banishment from the hall and an obligation to pay for the laundry of everyone sitting within 10 feet. It's a fascinating look at how a society of warriors tried to manufacture refinement in a world that didn't even have indoor plumbing yet. 38. In elite military orders, your armor wasn't just for protection, it was a legal mirror. Regulations dictated that a knight's breastplate had to be polished so brightly that an inspecting officer could clearly see his own reflection. If the metal was dull, rusty, or stained, the knight was legally charged with neglect of majesty. It's basically the medieval version of a fix-it ticket for a dirty windshield, but with the added threat of public shaming and a heavy hit to your social reputation. 39. During a royal address or a sacred religious ceremony, a knight was legally required to suppress any cough or sneeze. If he failed and interrupted the proceedings, he was often fined the equivalent of several months' pay for disturbing the royal peace. It sounds like an impossible standard of physical control. If you were legally liable for every involuntary noise your body made during a work meeting today, how much of your paycheck would you actually have left at the end of the month? 40. The dying horse law was the ultimate seniority perk. If a knight's horse died during a campaign and his superior officer's horse also died, the lower-ranking knight was legally required to hand over his own replacement horse to the superior. The subordinate would then have to walk on foot while his boss rode, even if the subordinate was the one who had paid for the animal out of his own pocket. It's a brutal reminder that, in the world of chivalry, the person doing the most work often got the shortest end of the stick. 41. In the French courts of the late 14th century, a knight who accidentally tripped or stumbled while in the presence of a lady was legally required to convert the fall into a graceful kneel. If he didn't immediately transition into a gesture of romantic devotion or a deep bow, it was considered a public display of unrefined clumsiness that could lead to a fine from the court's chamberlain. It's a hilarious image of a warrior catching his toe on a rug and having to instantly pretend he's proposing, or swearing a vow of eternal service just to avoid a legal reprimand. 42. Table manners were so legally fraught that even the way you handled a shared cup was regulated. Under many chivalric codes, a knight was legally forbidden from wiping his mouth with his hand or his sleeve before drinking from the communal goblet. He was required to use a specific napkin or a designated portion of the tablecloth. Failing to do so was considered an act of social contamination and could get you barred from future feasts. It seems medieval lawmakers were obsessed with hygiene, even if they didn't quite understand how germs worked yet. 43. There was a bizarre legal statute regarding the ransom of the squire. If a knight's squire was captured but the knight himself escaped, the knight was legally obligated to pay a portion of his own income to free the squire. If he refused, he was seen as violating the sacred bond of mentorship and could be sued for breach of contract. It turned the master-apprentice relationship into a legally protected investment, ensuring that knights didn't just treat their assistants as disposable meat shields on the battlefield. 44. The son-law in tournaments was a serious piece of legal maneuvering. Before a joust, the two competing knights had to draw lots to see who would face the sun. However, if one knight was significantly higher in rank, the law often dictated that the junior knight was legally required to take the blind side with the sun in his eyes. It was a legal way to ensure that the important people kept winning, proving that even in a supposed contest of skill, the legal system was rigged to favor the status quo. 45. In certain chivalric orders, a knight who was on a quest was legally permitted to stop anyone on a bridge or at a crossroads and demand a duel simply for the right to pass. This wasn't just random bullying. It was a legally recognized passage of arms. The knight was required to display his coat of arms and a formal challenge. If you were a traveler just trying to get home with your groceries, you could literally be legally delayed by a man in a metal suit who was bored and looking for a fight. Does this sound like a noble pursuit of excellence or just state-sanctioned highway robbery for the elite? 46. If a knight died in battle, his legal life didn't necessarily end. Under some jurisdictions, a knight's debt was considered a debt of honor that his horse and armor, his primary legal assets, were required to pay off before they could be inherited by his sons. The creditors could literally sue a dead man's equipment. It's the original, you can't take it with you, except the legal system would make sure your favorite warhorse was sold off to pay for that fancy silk doublet you bought 3 years ago. 47. The silence of the blade was a law in some elite units that forbade any knight from speaking while their sword was unsheathed, unless they were shouting a war cry or giving a command. To engage in idle chatter with a drawn weapon was a legal violation of the weapon's dignity. It was a way to ensure that the tools of war were treated with a semi-religious reverence. If you were forced to stay completely silent every time you held a sharp object, would it make you more mindful? Or would you just find yourself communicating through a very aggressive series of eyebrow raises? 48. Sumptuary laws didn't just govern clothes, they governed food. A knight was legally restricted in the number of courses he could be served during a private meal. In some parts of England, a knight was allowed 3 courses, while a lord could have 5. If a knight was caught eating a 5th-course delicacy like a roasted swan, he was technically committing a legal offense against his rank. It was a world where your stomach's capacity was literally dictated by your social standing. 49. Before a formal duel, knights were legally required to swear that they weren't carrying any charms, spells, or herbs of witchcraft hidden in their armor. This was a serious legal oath, and if a knight was found to have a lucky rabbit's foot or a piece of parchment with a prayer on it after he won, the victory was legally voided. He could even be tried for sorcery. It shows that while they trusted their steel, they were absolutely terrified of someone having a supernatural cheat code on the battlefield. Alright, we've covered 49 of the most ridiculous rules from the Age of Knights, and only one remains. But before we reveal number 50, it's time for the final verdict. After looking at the sheer absurdity of these laws, we believe the award for the most mind-boggling rule goes to point 23, the vow of the bird. There is just something uniquely medieval about a group of grown, highly trained warriors legally binding themselves to life-altering hardships because they got emotional in front of a roasted pheasant. It perfectly captures the intersection of extreme bravery and total, hilarious nonsense that defines chivalry. Do you agree with our verdict, or was the no-crying law the real winner for you? Let us know in the comments. And now, our final entry. 50. The strangest chivalric law of all was the trial of the inanimate object. If a knight's sword broke during a critical moment of a duel, causing him to lose his life or his honor, the sword itself could be legally put on trial for treason against its master. The broken pieces of metal would be brought before a magistrate, sentenced, and then publicly melted down or thrown into a deep river as a form of execution. It was a legal system so obsessed with responsibility that it even held the tools of the trade accountable for bad luck. Chivalry was never really about romance. It was a chaotic game of Simon Says, played with sharp swords and massive egos. From the way you held your wine to the legal execution of a broken blade, these warriors were trapped in a bureaucratic fever dream that prioritized style over common sense. It's a vivid reminder that human history is mostly just a series of very confident, very strange mistakes. If you were suddenly dropped into a medieval court, which of these bizarre laws would be the first to land you in the village stocks? Share your most chaotic answers in the comments. If you enjoyed this journey through historical madness, hit like and subscribe to see what we uncover next.